Welcome to Chatham House on what is actually 31 days, 31 years rather, to the day since Ukraine's independence was ratified by referendum. 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence on that day, and a majority in every region. But now, of course, it's 281 days of war since Russia began its second invasion of Ukraine in order to kill that independence. And so far, it has killed approximately 47,000 Ukrainians, just possibly relevant to what we're going to talk about today. My name is James Nixie. I'm the director of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. So thank you again for coming. That's the 220 odd in this room, and I think the 300 or so online. I don't know precisely all your motivations for coming here today, but I can hazard a guess. And my guess is that for most of you here and online, you all care deeply about this region that we rather unsatisfactorily call the former Soviet Union, the post-Soviet space, Eurasia, the newly independent states, even the CIS at one point. But whatever we call it and how we think about it, I know we're horrified and deeply concerned about what is happening to it. And just to be absolutely clear, when I say what is happening to it, I mean the unimaginable suffering that Russia is inflicting upon the region with its genocidal war. Primarily in Ukraine, of course, but with reverberations in every direction outward from there. Now, Chatham House and so many other places have been rightly concerned about the global effects of this war, from energy to food, from international law to global economics, from Beijing to Washington. This war is truly all-encompassing. And I know my colleagues at Chatham House, wider Chatham House in particular, have really stepped up to the plate on that score and contributing to insight and expertise on these wide-ranging aspects. And we'll absolutely continue to do that and look at the global grip of this war, particularly as a one-year anniversary of it looms, I guess. But today we are primarily concerned with the region, however we call it, but from Chisinau to Dushanbe, from Arkhangelsk to Yerevan, all via Kiev, of course. And some regional generalizations are unavoidable, but we're also going to be as country-specific as we can possibly be for the most part, and you'll see that in the program, of course. But the point I really want to get across, ladies and gentlemen, is that I suppose, as best as experts are able to on the basis of deep knowledge and experience, we need to ask the very toughest of questions today as to whether this region has a future as a region, whether certain countries have a future, and if so, what kind? Prosperous and peaceful, or poverty-stricken hellscapes? We all want it to be the former, but wanting it doesn't make it so. And so it's incumbent upon us in independent Chatham House to pose these most difficult of questions of others and of ourselves, and naturally, being Chatham House, to offer up ideas. Right, talking of experts, it's a key principle in sport to back your own team, and that's basically what we've done here. I haven't done the math, but I think about 60 to 70% of today's participants are involved with Chatham House in one way or another, probably an inversion of how it normally is. But I would actually reason that makes the non-Chatham House participants, our guests, and you, the audience, even more important to stress test each other's analyses throughout the day. That's pretty much it. I was told I didn't need to do any housekeeping rules, but I must just thank two Chatham House departments for the extraordinary work they've put in today. First is Leslie McKenna's and Camille Hussein's conference organizing unit. They put in quite an extraordinary amount of a level of detail that's quite frankly mind-boggling. So thank you to Eleanor, Victoria, Sam, and plenty of others, Claire. Thank you very much. And also, of course, my own Russia and Eurasia program team, not Eurasia there, under very difficult personal circumstances, I must say. Make no mistake, this is raw for many of my team. They've really knocked it out of the park making this happen. And finally, of course, obviously, I must thank the supporters of this conference, without whom it would not have happened. They're named on the back of your physical programs and online, of course. So that really is it. I do hope that everybody learns something and has a better understanding of the region, of the future of the region after today, an appreciation of it, if need be, perhaps. I know my team and I look forward to imparting and imbibing those ideas I was talking about on how to secure the region's constituent countries for peace and prosperity and the freedom and the independence that have so long eluded most of them, I suppose. So I welcome you here all again. Now, the best thing about not having a flashy, starry keynote speaker is we can quickly and easily segue into the substance of the first session without too much hassle. So could I possibly invite the first panel right in front of me to come to the stage, please, and we will begin. Welcome, everybody, to the first session, the Russia session. What kind of Russia will emerge from the war? I can't think of a more crucial question. I was best to do, I suppose, very quick intros. I know they're there, but to my immediate left, I'll just go down the line. Anna Maria Dinar, Polish analyst at PISM, the Polish Institute for International Affairs. Joanna Shostak, associate fellow on the Russia and Eurasia program, looks at media and its intersection nexus with politics. Keir Giles, staff writer at The Guardian, no, just kidding, consulting fellow at Chatham House, long time here, and Kolya Nikolai Petrov, senior research fellow on the Russia and Eurasia program, looking at domestic Russia issues. So welcome all, thank you very, very much indeed. And my job is kind of easy here because all I'm really going to do is initially ask you for bullet points that are in the first session. You should have them in your program. So pretty tough, I'll select according to expertise, if that makes any sense whatsoever. And I suppose what we'll do that for about half the time, 45 minutes. That will leave us around about 45 minutes for questions and discussion online and in the hall. So you've seen the bullet points, so it's not going to come as a great surprise to you. Kolya, let's start over there with you. What is this war going to do to Russia and to the Russian people? Your people.
Thank you, James. Let me start with a kind of disclaimer. I feel like the war is going on in my homeland because I've spent a good portion of my life both in Crimea and in Eastern Ukraine. I was PhD student for Donetsk, and my family roots partly goes from Zaporizhzhia siege. And that's why I do feel it as a very horrible thing from both sides. And I think that the more complicated view we have of what's going on, the more effective lessons we can learn from what's going on and how to avoid something similar in the future. In my view, this is a kind of imperialistic war. It's not the war between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians. It's the war between remainder of Russian Empire, including ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians, and Ukraine, which is now invaded by this remainder of Russian Empire. And that's why I think that the war has started not even in 2014, but in 1994, when Moscow did start the war against Chechnya. And then in the year 2000, there was the Second Chechenian War. And by the way, the scale of atrocities there was similar, but the scale of the whole war theater was much less than in Ukraine. And I would call it the World War, according to not only sides participating, but negative consequences for the whole world. And hopefully it's the last Russia's imperial war, but nobody can be sure in this. So consequences for Russia are absolutely deadly. And it's impossible to live under those sanctions and under those regime. In my view, regime cannot survive because of the political economic model it was based on is over. It was rent redistributing economy. And not only political economic model, but the base of political stability without effective political institutions. Political stability in Russia is based on Putin's huge popularity. It's coming down now due to understandable reasons. So there are no questions, in my view, that regime will collapse in a year or 2 years. Nobody knows how long it will take and whether it will take part before Putin's disappearance or immediately after Putin's disappearance. But in my view, there is no way to keep the regime. However, as I was trying to explain in our set of articles on myth about Russia, the next regime and what will come after Putin will be not necessarily better than what we see now under Putin because of the lack of political institutions, the lack of political elites, the lack of needed political culture. So my best case scenario is very long, for decades, step-by-step development of Russia in positive direction, which will not necessarily take part immediately after the collapse of the regime. What we see now is separation of Russian citizens. And in my view, it's very important when speaking about prospects of future to think about Russia not only in terms of Russia and its territory, but in terms of Russian people. So now separation is going on. Part of Russians fled from the country. It's several 100,000. And I am mapping now the places where Russian experts are located. And I would say that it's very impressive map. And it means that not only part of Russians and part of Russian, well, the best part perhaps, or the most prepared. I'm not saying now you can see in internet there are very intensive fights between those who are outside Russia and those who are inside of Russia. And the usual position is for one part of Russians to blame another part. So it's understandable that not everybody could leave from the country and not everybody does support now Putin's regime. I'm
going to stop you because I'm going to come back to you.
My very last point, James, that the most recent poll did show that 55% of Russians are in favor of negotiations and only 25% are in favor of continuing the military operations.
Interesting. Thank you. And I will come right back to you. I'm going to sort of front load you. Joanna, same question. What will the war do to Russia and the Russians?
So I think I agree with Kolya on some points, perhaps less confident about the sort of collapse of the regime in a few years. I mean, it would be nice, but I'm not quite so confident there. I mean, I think what we can say is what has happened to Russia already is that Russia has become more repressive, even from the high levels of repression that existed before February. You know, the level of tolerance for speaking out, criticizing the regime, its policies in any way, you know, that level of tolerance has sort of shrunk to almost nothing. Penalties now for trying to organize any kind of collective action. Again, speaking out, you know, those penalties have become much tougher and sort of more brutal, really. And I think perhaps the basis, the sort of foundations that the regime maintains itself upon are shifting from that sort of popular support, or at least apathy, to more towards repression. And I think, you know, the capacity for repression within Russia is formidable, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And the ability of the regime to hold itself up by means of mainly of repression is something that shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, you can compare in a way to Belarus. I mean, look at the protests there against Lukashenko were enormous, and yet Lukashenko is very much still there. I mean, you can talk about what the war is doing in the short term to Russia and what it's likely to do in the longer term. So yeah, the short term we see repression on the rise. Longer term, though, I mean, I only see the war weakening Russia in a whole manner of ways. Economically, you know, spoke a little bit about sort of Russians fleeing the country, often the better educated ones, often the more capable ones. You know, that's an erosion of Russia's capacity to innovate, capacity to produce economically, demographically as well. I mean, Russia's had demographic issues for years and years, and has recognized those demographic challenges, aging population and so on, and yet it's sending, you know, tens of thousands of its young men to die and to be injured. So yeah, sort of demographic economic weakening in the longer term, and in the short term, repression. So yeah, I mean, imagine we're going to talk more about the future of Russia, and quite yeah, how long this regime can maintain itself. But I am somewhat less, well, yeah.
Can I specifically ask you, and then Kolya again, about the brain drain?
Mhm.
I can't quite, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that Russia's best and its brightest have fled. And it's almost again, the flip side to Ukraine, where so many have stayed, the best and brightest, and certainly generationally you see that. Look at the age of Russia's leaders and the age of Ukraine's leaders. So what's the effect? Well, can you go into a little more detail on the effects of this brain drain, considering the numbers involved?
Mhm. I mean, we don't have sort of firm statistics about how many people have left and precisely who has left. I mean, the estimates that I've seen suggest it's somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people fleeing the country. We don't know who's gone back. Some of those who left, particularly in sort of the earlier sort of immediate months immediately following the invasion, reports of tens of thousands of IT workers specifically leaving the country. And that obviously has an impact on actually Russia's ability to produce the technologies that it needs to keep fighting in Ukraine, and also to maintain the sort of surveillance apparatus within Russia itself. I mean, that there is an awful lot of unknown surrounding quite how that capacity is being affected, but they may find that they having to rely more on the external sort of partners that they still have, whether that's Iran or sort of other places to provide what they need in terms of technology. But yeah, there's an awful lot of unknown. Politically, though, it's worth saying as well, when you talk about emigration from Russia, often the focus is on the economics of it, but politically what they might be left with is actually sort of beneficial for them in the sense that people who might otherwise have organized in some way against the regime, potentially, that they're now, in Kazakhstan or Georgia or here or somewhere else.
Thank you. Kolya, Russia is being hollowed out in terms of its skilled human resources, right?
Yes, right. But brain drain is going on for many, many years. Right. And the reason why is that the regime was not interested in any kind of different economic model. And in order to keep afloat rent redistributing model, it was needed something like, say, 20 million persons. And for a while, it looked like, similarly to China, Putin did decide somehow to attract back those who left from the country, and it was more or less effective. Let me remind you, Skolkovo project, but now there is no need in those persons, and that's why regime does let them to go out, and it's easier for them to let them out than to keep everybody there. And I would remind you famous Vasily Aksionov's novel, The Island of Crimea, where he describes the situation that during the Civil War, Crimea was not kept by Bolsheviks, and it was developing separately from Russia. And it did develop like Hong Kong in a very astonishing, very democratic way. Unfortunately, the end of the novel is not very optimistic. Russia invades Crimea back and everything else. Now we do have this island of Crimea everywhere outside of Russia. And I think this keeps us at least a little bit positive with regard to Russia's future, not in terms of its integrity and its territory, but in terms of population.
Absolutely, yeah. Crimea, of course, is an island to Russia, but a peninsula to Ukraine. I'm sure we'll cover that later. Now, let's mix it up a bit. Anna Maria, welcome again. It seems that at the heart of this is Russia's relationship to the other post-Soviet states, for want of that better expression. So what do you think can change the Russian mindset at all levels, at the popular level, at the elite level, into having that sort of more equal relationship, shall we say, between Russia and anybody else?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. For me, taking into account that from the perspective of international law, Belarus also is an aggressor. We have a situation that Poland neighbors 3 countries which are in war now. So very specific situation as well for us and for the whole region and eastern flank of NATO. But coming back to your question about the future of Russia and the attitude towards other states from the post-Soviet space, and maybe even for this East Central Europe. Everything depends on what will be the last result of the war. if Russia will, to some extent, win somehow this war, I will say that we will have more imperialistic Russia on our borders in just a few years. And it's extremely dangerous from the perspective of eastern flank countries, especially the Baltic states, but Poland as well. And if not, everything also depends on what Russia we will have after the war, because the best option for us, unfortunately, I'm not so optimistic that it will be the most probable. It will be the real democratization and demilitarization of this country. Something which the demilitarization, yes, this is a slogan with which Russia started this part of war and invade Ukraine in the 24th February. But definitely without paying reparations to Ukraine, without demilitarizations, without changing a mindset of both the elite and ordinary people, we won't have any good result from the future. Because nowadays, when we look what is going on in Russia, on one hand, of course, it's a real war in Ukraine, but on the other, it's a hybrid war with the Western countries, with NATO especially. So still, the enemy is on the Western side. Moreover, when we are thinking about the Russians, they, after the war, if it ends, that Ukraine will win. Of course, from our perspective, is just Russia withdraw the troops and Ukraine come back to the border from 2013. So it also includes Crimea as such. But first of all, the society has to admit that it was a huge mistake, that they hurt Ukraine, that they want to change themselves. And they have to think that Russia is not imperium anymore, that Russia doesn't need special guarantees.
And can they? How do they?
You know, I'm not that's why I'm said I'm not optimistic. So definitely I cannot imagine them that Russia will stress that they do not need special guarantees, special right to its own sphere of influence, or its predestination to be one of the global leaders. So the hard job is from the Western side, I will put it like that, to prepare the hardest sanctions to help Ukraine both militarily now to win the war, and then financially to reestablish the state. And then, of course, is the way of our thinking not to have the business as usual, like we have some voices from, unfortunately, also from our allies within NATO and the EU. Concluding, definitely everything will depend on what stage this war will end.
Can I put that one to you, Joanna? Can Russia change the way it looks at Ukraine?
Whilst Putin is still in charge, no. So, because Putin can't change the way he sees Ukraine. I mean, that's become quite clear. I mean, I think he's trapped in a sort of the swamp of his own propaganda, essentially. I mean, he has always seen Ukraine as this sort of artificial weak state, and therefore that's the message that's projected by the Russian media, and that message comes right back at him, really. And you know, so he's told by his subordinates that Ukraine is a weak and artificial state, and then when he tries to invade in February, he expects to find a weak and artificial state that he can, you know, take in 3 days and so on, and he doesn't find that because he's fundamentally wrong. And nothing that has happened since. I mean, he's just doubling down, and you know, now that, you know, it seems that how can Russia not be, you know, defeating this weak artificial state, Ukraine? Oh, it must be NATO. You know, it's sort of, yeah. He's completely incapable of seeing Ukraine as a genuine, independent, sovereign state capable of fighting for its own existence.
And
I
in
mean,
a post-Putin world, the popular mindset.
World, it's nice to think about a post-Putin world and what that might look like. I mean, Russia is obviously investing very heavily at the moment in indoctrination, right? At every level, this is alongside the repression. You've sort of seen these sort of educational programs in schools trying to get all Russians to think like Putin does in terms of its sort of imperial ambitions and so on. I'm not sure how successful how deep this indoctrination is actually going to go. Because as I think I said earlier, I mean, apathy is really the quality that characterizes most Russians' relationship to politics. So I think it is possible, if, hypothetically, you could get a leader in place in Russia that would change the tune in, the education system, in the media, then Russians would probably follow the change of tune from above, I think, because Russian public opinion is a remarkable thing. Up until February, you saw most Russians telling pollsters that, yes, we think Russia and Ukraine should be, separate countries, borders, etc., normal separate relationship. And now, if Putin says, "Oh, we think we should, merge as much as possible of Ukraine into Russia," the Russians will agree with that, and you'll have a healthy majority, because that's just how public opinion at the moment seems to work. Which gives some causes for hope, but then also for depression. So,
well, Kier's about to speak now, so I'm not sure about causes for hope. We're going to carry on. Kier, you've been very patient. Kier, maybe part of the answer to the last question in terms of how do we get Russia to change the way it sees the region comes into the idea that Russia needs to be defeated. And I assume you agree with that. We've chatted enough for me to know that it is true. So I guess, but it's a more complex question than that. And I suppose I'd ask you, what kind of defeat is needed? What does defeat look like? Is a common question these days. That would be good for obviously Ukraine, but actually for the world.
Well, there's a huge range of different possible outcomes to the current conflict. And I'm concerned that the optimism that we hear about the course of the war is unfounded, because it tends to be based on looking at what is happening on the front line and recent Ukrainian battlefield successes. But this isn't a war that is going to be decided on the battlefield. And Russia decided that a long time ago. The problem is that of all those possible outcomes, there's only a very small subset that would bring about the start of the kind of change within Russia that you're talking about, making Russia less of a threat to its neighbors, and indeed less of a threat to its own population in the ways that we've heard. There are possible different routes to that, but the key criterion that binds them all together is the only reason for Russia to change its mind about its relationship with its neighbors is a realization among the current leadership and the future leadership that engaging in a war on Ukraine, a war of colonial reconquest, was a colossal strategic blunder that shouldn't be repeated. That's the only way in which we're going to step away from this mindset that we've heard about already, this imperialist mindset that Russia is entitled to dominion over those sovereign independent states around its periphery. But it's not the only thing that has to change for Russia to be less of a danger. The roots go much deeper than that. Look at, for example, not just what Russia thinks it's entitled to, but also how Russia thinks it's entitled to go about getting it. The notion that if these countries are not willing to submit to rule from Moscow, then the appropriate response is to wage a war of genocide against them, in order that you bring them in by force through the most barbaric and savage means possible. And that, too, is something that needs to change for Russia to be less of a threat. And it goes very deeply into the approach to problems of the Russian leadership and of its armed forces. So consider the campaign we're seeing at the moment. It's a result of Russia looking at new military technologies becoming available and thinking of applying them in the polar opposite way to how Western militaries thought they'd be used. Western militaries thought we have precision weapons. This means that we can target military facilities while minimizing civilian casualties and collateral damage, which we don't want to happen. Russia looks at the same technology and thinks, excellent, we have more precise weapons. We can more precisely target civilian humanitarian infrastructure in order to trigger humanitarian catastrophes, as we've seen repeated on a small scale in Syria over and over again, and now on a huge scale in Ukraine, because Russia, recognizing that it cannot win on the front line, looks for a strategic means of bending Ukraine to its will. The problem that we have, and this comes back to the root of your question, what kind of change do we need? The problem we have is that the rest of the world has sleepwalked into tacit acceptance of this way of waging war. It has joined in Russia's game, playing by Russia's rules. While Russia does its best to destroy everything within Ukraine that is capable of sustaining life over the winter, the rest of the world has tried to help Ukraine in joining that race of trying to rebuild before the next wave of missiles comes in. Instead of stepping back, looking at this from the side and realizing that it is an obscenity, it is an abomination that this is happening, and it needs to stop. And that requires a change of mindset from all of Ukraine's backers. And it is only that which will lead to a situation which brings about that change of mind in Russia itself about whether this is an appropriate and effective means of getting what Russia wants and what Russia actually wants in the first place, whether that has a place in 21st century Europe.
Absolutely, thank you. Same question to you, Anna Maria. What kind of defeat, and perhaps extending it a little bit, what kind of outcome would be disastrous? What worst case and best case scenarios, perhaps?
So worst case scenario is that Russia will win and will be able to grab Ukraine, and Western countries will, how to say, maybe not come back to the business as usual, but won't change anything in their previous policy towards Russia. I totally agree with Keir that maybe not the half of what is happening is our fault, but definitely Western countries also encourage Russia after Georgia 2008 and after invasion of Crimea to do the same in the future. So it's the worst case scenario. Also, not good case scenario, put it like that, is that the war will be prolonged. First of all, because of Ukraine. Second of all, because of our will to help Ukrainians and our will to let the very restrict policy towards Russia. Moreover, we also have to think about ourselves. I also touched my, maybe not beloved, but something which I'm dealing with in regular life. It's a hybrid threats, including cyber one, including information warfare, including also physical attacks on critical infrastructure within the whole European part of NATO, maybe also the US as well. And also including something which is very dangerous also from Polish perspective. It's instrumentalization of migration, which we are facing from a year and a half on our border with Belarus. So, and the best case scenario, of course, but probably also the most difficult one is total defeat of Russia, that Russia will really change its political system, because we just also touched the case, what will happen if Putin will resign. I'm also very afraid that we will have Putin 2.0, which will be even worse scenario than Putin 1.0. It's the first issue. We also have to think that Putin is a product of the system. So definitely we have to change the system within Russia, and it will be extremely difficult. And one thing more, it's also a hard job for the Western countries to do, is just to work with other parts of the world. I mean, Africa, the Middle East, South Africa, because there is a place when Russia is seeking for their partners, maybe not the alliances, but nevertheless, it cooperates with those countries, and we can see it not only in the UN, but in some other issues. And it's also the way how we have to think about somehow trying to isolate Russia politically and economically. Nowadays, unfortunately, it's impossible. So 3 scenarios. Sorry to say, I cannot predict which is nowadays the most probable, because still people are fighting in Ukraine.
Thank you. Back to you, Keir. And the questions are going to get a bit spicier. You and I have talked a lot over the years as to whether we have a Russia problem or a Putin problem. And I think we've actually slightly disagreed on it, honestly. I realize you think that Putin is almost a relatively, relative to Russia's history, a benevolent leader compared to some of the atrocities that have undergone under the stewardship of previous Russian presidents and secretaries general. So the question is, bearing in mind, I know you don't put all the blame on Putin. I think there's a lot more to it than that, and that's entirely correct. then, but unless he's signed off on this, he's made the decisions, he's the most powerful man in Russia. So to what extent should we be trying to hasten his exit? I know our colleague Tim Ash has said, well, we probably should be trying to do this a little bit more overtly. You know, they're doing it, they believe we do it to them anyway. They're doing it to us anyway in terms of trying to manipulate elections. So why not do it back, since he's at least sort of partly the root of a problem. You and I even chat. I remember when Lindsey Graham said something like, why doesn't someone just shoot him in the back of the neck? And you and I chatting, you said, it's not the worst thing Lindsey Graham, most stupid idea Lindsey Graham has ever had. So should we try to hasten his demise?
I find it hard to imagine a circumstance under which I would have described Putin as benevolent.
Yeah, maybe I might have overrated the pudding there.
I have said that he is not the worst leader that Russia has ever had or could ever have, whether that's with regard to his own population or to the outside world. And this is part of a broader conversation that James and I have had over the years, one of our very few points of disagreement about the trajectory of Russia, where James would disagree with me when I said things were bad, but they were going to get much worse. A few years ago, when the Moscow Rules book came out, this was his main point, that surely things are bad enough already. And my point was, this is Russia. It can always get worse. And that, unfortunately, is the key to that question about what happens without Putin, because Russia's current policy is not a product of Putin's mind. It is the reverse. Putin is a product of Russia. In order to remove Putinism, you need to remove an entire political leadership class and go deep into the roots of society that agree with them. And that requires that kind of fundamental change that we were talking about, which under current circumstances is not going to happen. Should we attempt to, not me personally, should an attempt be made to remove Putin? Again, I see no circumstances under which that would actually make things better, not worse. Okay. Because who is there to replace him? Putin has worked extremely hard to remove any viable alternatives to his rule. And viable, I mean, in terms of improving relationships with the West, not making them worse. Plus, of course, you immediately bring up all of the problems that were challenging to Russia's neighbors in the early 1990s, the problems of instability, where Russia, instead of deliberately invading its neighbors, causes them harm through the spillover of its own chaos, with the added spice of who exactly is in charge of weapons of mass destruction now. So while it might be tempting, and it always is tempting, to look for better alternatives to Putin and to hope that they must exist, and also to hope for, as we've heard it said for the last decade and a half, the imminent demise of the Putin regime, that won't necessarily help. It won't stop people clutching for straws in the wind, thinking this is the evidence of the fracture in the system that we've been looking for, and now it is all going to become tumbling down, but it will take a great deal longer than those people hope for. And it already has taken a great deal longer.
You want to disagree with that on the panel? Yeah, good. If there's a disagreement.
I think I do agree almost totally, but the way we answer this question can be different a while ago and now. And it looks, in my view, like Russian roulette, in a sense that, yeah, it's absolutely unknown whether regime will survive after Putin and whether it will become worse or it will become better. But among those scenarios which are very widespread now, there is scenario that Putin evaporates somehow. And there are two different options for Putin to be replaced either by the guy from this Siloviki camp, which are becoming more and more unpopular due to the development of events, or whether he will be replaced by a kind of technocrat like Mikhail Mishustin, whose next move should be to do something in order to soften sanctions and to come back from Ukraine. So I think that, unfortunately, there is no, and we cannot be sure that results will be good. That's why it's very dangerous, but results can be not necessarily bad.
That makes sense to me, Kolya. You don't know who you're going to get, but there is at least a possibility that the next person on the throne will be offered olive branches by every Western leader to try to make things better, and that he himself, I assume it's a he, will realize that Russia has gone down a path that is unsustainable and untenable. Yeah, clearly, Anna Maria Fersink here.
Okay, so to some extent, it sounds great that replacing Putin will probably change the future of Russia, but we also have to be very careful about who will be the next leader, because we cannot make one mistake that after Putin will come somebody who will present himself or herself, but rather himself, as a democratic guy who will change the political system of Russia, ideology of this country, and so forth, so on. And we have to, we, the West, have to help him to do so, lift sanctions, resign from that. Even I've heard about some plans of so-called Marshall Plan to Russia. And I'm just, on the back of my head, had questions about Ukraine, but let's put it to the next panel. And it may occur that, yes, they will, the Russians will use our Western will to help them. And in the end, it occurred that we will have imperialistic Russia like 3.0 or something else, very strong one, which which won't resign from seeing us as a main enemy. So here is, from my perspective, the most dangerous point.
You wanted to come back,
Absolutely, with Anna Maria, but also super briefly, you said it's a possibility that Western leaders would offer the olive branch, would try to welcome the new leader. I think it's a near certainty, because once again, based on optimism rather than sober analysis, they'll leap at the chance and the hope for change.
But it's more advisable to do that with Mishustin than with Patrushev, right? There's a different character. So.
Well, you and I know the difference.
Yeah, right. Okay, Anna, actually back to you anyway, as it happens. Russia's campaign, its quest for global influence, has tentacles everywhere. Tentacles because they come back to the center, I suppose. What's going to happen to that?
Also very probably I just also touch the question. Russia is very visible in Africa and the Middle East, and as well in Southern America. We can observe their very high activity within social media, with let's say regular media like RT, which is nowadays forbidden within the EU, like Sputnik, in plenty of branches. And why it's so dangerous and important for us, because it changes the view of those countries, what is going on in Ukraine. When we are talking with our institutional partners from Southern America, they just said directly that it's the fault of the US, because they also have very specific their own history with the United States. And that's why they are thinking about that the US was someone who want to interfere in Russian sphere of influence. But we also have to think about something which I touched, talking about hybrid threats. It's this instrumentalization of migration, because then Russia, especially in Africa and in the Middle East, is trying to say that it's the Western fault from their local problems. So please came to Europe and take what belongs to you. So that's why we have to be very careful about those policy. It's popular and it's very visible. So from our perspective, it's a hard job to do, to oppose somehow such narrative in other places like that. Of course, from the very beginning, we said that it's also the Ukrainian diplomacy who has to do their own job, but they have much more crucial points. So that's why we have to maybe not replace them, but try to also change the mindset of people living in other places of the world. And it's also dangerous from one more perspective. We are, as the Western countries, thinking about sanctions, especially on military issues, dual-use technologies, and so forth, so on. But if we won't protect the chain of shifting those goods, it may occur that the last buyer will be Russians, which will not be good as well for Ukrainians and us.
Right. Final question for actually both of you, Anna and Keir, before I have one for each of you, a final one, and I'll turn to the audience. Given a Russian defeat, more or less, however you want to describe a Russian defeat, however messy it is, we discussed it. It's conceivable we'll see a more resentful, spurned, humiliated Russia, weakened for sure. How do you go about dealing with that? So you've achieved your victory in Ukraine, more or less. Ukraine's pretty much got what it wants, but you don't, of course, that doesn't make Russia nicey, happy, clappy. You have a much more, as I say, resentful nation. Where do we go from there? Keir first, perhaps, then Anna?
The
Maria?
problem is exactly the same whether Russia wins or loses. Wins,
Right.
it's emboldened to have another go.
Mhm.
Loses, it is, as you say, resentful and waits a bit longer to have another go.
Right. Mhm.
The challenge for the rest of the world remains exactly the same. And it's the same as it always has been, while Russia has been waging this war against the West in all domains except open military clashes for so long. And it is to contain the damage. It is to try to limit the opportunities for Russia to cause the harm to countries around it and further afield that it wants to. And that means closing off our own vulnerabilities to those methods of waging war to which we've left ourselves so open for so long. And this, of course, is not just a response to Russia. It's a response to any other actor around the world that wishes to cause us harm or subvert our societies. The same methods for subversion-proofing our society and our politics and our democracies work for Russia as they do, for example, against China. And at some level, it's indistinguishable in many countries from basic good governance, making sure that systems work in the way that they should in order that they do not allow those gaps for exploitation and for corruption and for diverting political processes.
Got it.
All of that remains exactly the same.
Anna Maria, finally from you, how do we, given that it's going to continue as it's been, we're not going to see this nicey, touchy-feely Russia, how do we deal with this continued Russia challenge?
I totally agree with Keir that we have to, first of all, think that it may happen, that we have to be prepared for a very long period of gray zone war, I will put it like that. We have to think about probably also defending ourselves, also in a way of thinking that just jump to the military doctrine of Union State of Belarus and Russia and Belarusian one. They don't have just the wartime and peacetime. They have also the middle time of the rising military threats. We don't. So we as countries, especially when we are thinking about those hybrid threats, we are not ready to defend ourselves with using tools from the war period of time. We are limiting ourselves to the peacetime. They don't have such kind of limitations. So probably also is our job to rethink our way of defending ourselves. It's one issue. Second issue, of course, is to have a real long-term policy towards Russia, including plenty of scenarios, also including this very optimistic one of real democratization, something which the EU prepared. For instance, I know that Belarus is a much smaller country, but nevertheless, a European Commission decided that if there will be democratization, there are huge funds reserved for helping Belarusian economy. So maybe also such kind of way of thinking, not only the stick, but also carrot as well. Still, from our perspective, especially Poland, having democratic Russia will be very good because still it's from our perspective the main threat for the region.
Got it. Thank you. Right. Almost time to go to the audience, but I want to ask you all one question each, the same question actually, and really 1 minute answers, please. I believe they're going to clip it out and do something fancy with it, so no pressure. But whatever that means. I'll start with you, Kolya. Very simply. Can there ever be a better Russia? If so, how?
I am trying now to look systemically at all scenarios which I worked out. There are no good scenarios among them. And the way I did find is to think about Russia, not about its existence within its present borders, but about Russia as a culture, about Russia as population, and so on. And the fact that many of Russians are now here at the West and are considered to be almost enemies of Russia by the current regime means that there are hopes for future connected to them. But I do not see any good scenarios for Russia within its present borders.
Thanks. I'll just go down the line. Keir, Eva?
Every time-
You've been called an essentialist in the past, so I think you're relatively pessimistic about whatever Russia may become.
If I knew what that meant, I knew whether or not to be offended. Every time I hear this question, I'm reminded of the conversation that you and I were present at when a senior Russian diplomat proposed his solution. A diplomat that I think understood Russia very well proposed his solution for that problem. How to make a better Russia. How to make one that isn't at war with its own population and sporadically waging war against its neighbors. He said, you, meaning the Western Alliance, need to do to Russia what you did to Germany. You need to defeat it militarily, bomb it flat, occupy it for a number of decades, completely uproot its social and political system, and re-educate the population over a number of generations, and then you will have a country that doesn't want to wage war against its neighbors. So the short answer to your problem is, can we have a better Russia? Well, probably not, because that's not going to happen.
Wow. Okay. Joanna, can you beat that?
No, I can't. Yes, there can be a better Russia.
Good for you.
I mean, I don't see it as an imminent prospect, unfortunately, for all the reasons that we've already mentioned. But change will come, because change always comes. Putin is not going to last forever, because he's only human. You know, when Putin goes, there will be an opportunity for change, and that change could go in different directions. It could get worse. It could potentially get better. I mean, there are, you know, people, individuals within the elite, and certainly within the population, who might not be liberal, they might not be pro-Western, but they're more pragmatic than Putin.
Yeah.
I mean, and Putin used to be more pragmatic than he is now. And I mean, a better Russia, you know, a realistic vision of a better Russia will be a more pragmatic Russia, you know, that recognizes that this is, you know, the most strategically stupid thing that's, you know, their leadership has done in sort of living memory, probably. Trying to take Ukraine, because they cannot take Ukraine. I mean, that's the fundamental truth, that at some point they're going to have to grapple with. You know, that Ukraine, they want to wipe Ukraine from the map, and that cannot be done with the resources that they have. So, you know, at what point will that penny drop? That, you know, maybe it will take a very, very long time, but I do think there can be a better, less aggressive Russia at some point.
A better Russia, Anna Maria? Yeah.
Thank you, Claire, that you mentioned Germany, not me, because we always like there are posts who are anti-German and anti-Russian at the same time. But I would try to combine both perspectives for Claire and Joanna. Yes, there can be a better Russia if the Russians realize that they can change their own future, because Russia is a country with a huge normal perspective, taking into account technologies, knowledge, the space, and so forth, so on. If not, sorry to say, without those which Claire mentioned, probably we will have Russia as we have now, or even with worsened policy towards its close neighborhood.
Great. Thank you very much. About time we turned it over to you, ladies and gentlemen. That means you in the hall and you online. I've certainly got about 8, 9, 10 questions on screen, but I think I'll go to the room first to mix it up a bit. There are mics. We need the mics so people can hear online. So, go to Stefan Meister, who I know is speaking last. He's a middle left. Yeah, stand up, Stefan. Thank you. I'll take about 3 at a time, if I may.
Thank you very much. Can you can hear me. Stefan Meister, I'm with the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. Thank you very much for this panel. I really have some questions. I agree with Nikolai that this is about keeping the empire. This is in this sense an imperial war, and Putin gets exactly the opposite. Like in many other cases, he's accelerating the disintegration of the empire. But is not one of the key elements of this war the ethnic element? Destroy Ukraine as a state and as a society. And I think this is something which is Putin and the regime really inventing, this ethnical element of the war. And maybe one or two very quick questions. Do you think that Russia will be closed on one point because of the brain drain? And is it likely that there will be a disintegration also of Russia after defeat?
That's very much on our panel later, isn't
Yeah,
it, Stefan?
okay.
But okay. Mary Dejevsky, please. She's just to your left, but exactly, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Dejevsky. Sorry, losing my voice. Mary Dejevsky, a journalist. I've got one question which is not unrelated to the previous one. It's really for Nikolai, but anybody can answer it. James, in his introduction, and Keir in his presentation, described this war as a genocidal war. Do you agree?
Okay, thank you. And Sam de Bendern, right down here at the front, or almost at the front. Thank you. I'll just take these three and then we'll come back to your. No, right there, yeah. Right past.
Yes, hello. So my question is a little bit
Introduce yourself for a second.
Samantha de Benden, Associate Fellow at Chatham House, slightly following on some of the questions that have already been asked. It's about the disintegration of the Russian Federation. We've seen so much discontent amongst the mobilized from some of the non-Russian republics and movements, Free Buryatia, the Yakutia, going on about stop the genocide, i.e. stop the genocide of our people. Do you think that discontent amongst the non-Russian populations of Russia could hasten the defeat and hasten the demise of the regime?
Excellent. Actually, three sort of related questions there. Let's go to, you don't have to answer each and every one of you. We're not going to do it that way, but Kolya, I'll certainly turn to you first, since a couple were addressed directly at you.
Okay. I'll start with Stefan, and I'll say that not only we do see the war as the imperial one, but Russian propaganda does show it as an imperial war. But in this case, the imperial war against the West, which is trying to control all Russian neighbors and so on. And I do not think that closure of the country is very probable now, except for the fact that there is a kind of martial law in the country. You do not need to make any decisions. You can give orders and to do whatever you want, like say to use criminals, prisoners to fight in Ukraine. Now, disintegration. I would say that it's not very probable, at least now. And the reason why is connected with the fact that Russian regime is very flexible and it does have a lot of reserves. But in future, if to think that the model of how to keep all parts in Russia under huge centralized power, it was connected and it was possible due to huge rent. If this rent will shrink, then it will be not that easy for Russia to buy loyalty of regional elites and to keep it by force, because it will be needed to pay less for law enforcement and police and everything else. But I would say that disintegration of Russia is not very positive scenario, by the way. If Russia will disintegrate, then we'll have the same or much more complicated problems in many former parts of Russia, and there are no hopes that these parts will become more democratic than Russia, not to speak about nuclear weapons.
You want to say something again, Maria?
In PISM, we are nowadays working on a paper of 3 scenarios for future of Russia. One of them is disintegration one. I also think that it's the less possible. Why? Because in the huge majority of the subjects of Russian Federation, Russians are the majority. There are just only a few of the parts of Russia when the ethnical nations are the majority. One of the places is Southern Caucasus, but still it's the place when Единая Россия and Putin won every time in every election. Secondly, it's because of the totally dependence, financial and political, of regions on Moscow. Even if there are some very rich regions like those one from Siberia, they depends on infrastructure like gas pipelines, some other pipelines in infrastructural routes. And without central financing, it's impossible to maintain such kind of infrastructure. And we have plenty of other reasons why it will be extremely difficult to have disintegrated Russia. The more that Putin himself nowadays is thinking about how to say, shaping the governors of the subjects of federation, changing them and making them totally dependent on him. So that's why we cannot see, and Joanna also mentioned the high level of repression. We are not nowadays seeing any kind of local demonstration against, how to say, I put it like that, central authorities. Mm-hmm. And still, Putin and central authorities are very popular in the local societies as well.
Joanne, do you have a view on disintegration and what it might lead to?
I mean, I'll maybe pass on the disintegration topic because I think there are other people who can.
On the ethics side of things.
But I mean, I can comment on the genocidal war.
Okay, I was going to. That was what I was coming to. On the ethnic side of things, I was going to come to a genocide, of course, but on the ethnic side of things, anybody? I mean, Collier's already mentioned it. So.
Yes, I agree. There are not the ingredients for disintegration that were led to the scenario at the end of 1917. When Russia goes down this path of spending itself into state collapse in pursuit of an unwinnable war, there are a number of templates that it can follow. And some of the things that led to that 1921 situation that people are thinking about when they're looking at disintegration and lots of different federal subjects going their own way simply aren't present today. And one of the key elements of that glue holding Russia together is the financial subsidies that everybody's referred to. People look at Kadyrov's Chechnya and think, what if it went its own way? But then where would the money come from for Kadyrov to fund his lifestyle? And similarly, you don't have the things that led to the coup in 1917. You don't have an opposition which is active and capable and organized. You don't have a foreign power which is funding that opposition and seeking to depose the established democratic regime. All of those things aren't in place. And meanwhile, yes, there aren't those signs that it would be sensible for any of those federal subjects to go their own way at all.
Right. Let's get to, I was going to get onto a genocide question, but you've got one more thing to say?
Just very, very short answer to Mary at the recent Valdai Club. Okay. We're closely watching with Mary. Putin has been asked whether he sees this war as a civil war, if Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, and his answer was yes. So I would say that from Russia's side, we can speak about genocide, but not against Ukrainians, only against Russians as well. So this is genocide of Pol Pot style.
I think you're all going to answer it. Keir, I'll just get on the line.
I don't think I need to answer that.
Okay. Anybody? You said you were going to say something on genocide.
Yes, I mean, to me, in my understanding, what they're really trying to kill is the idea of Ukraine as a distinct nation from Russia. So, and yes, I mean, to achieve that aim, they're killing indiscriminately in vast numbers, as we're all tragically seeing and have seen since February and before even. So, yeah, I mean, it's if a Ukrainian will switch allegiance and say, oh, I'm a small Russian now, little Russian, and then that's what they're teaching in Russian schools now, that Ukraine is not Ukraine, it's little Russia. So it's I mean, I know there are legal probably definitions of genocide, and I'm not qualified to comment on the legal aspect of it, but they're trying to kill the idea of Ukraine, the reality of Ukraine as an independent nation state. And as part of that, they are killing their own people, they are killing Russian speakers, they are killing, Ukrainian speakers, ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Russians, and, whoever they think they need to achieve that geopolitical goal.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah,
who was originated yes, probably he will agree that it's such kind of war. The more when we observe Russian propaganda, there are not Ukrainians. There are just some Nazis in Ukraine. There is Kiev's regime and something else. They are even not human. So to some extent, yes, I totally agree with that. It is a genocide war.
Look, I would just say, perhaps in answer to Mary myself, that as far as Crimea is concerned, and the very idea that Crimea is Russian is A, imperial, and B, wrong, and B, ignores the genocide being committed on the Ukrainian population right now. That's my view on it, for what it's worth. We'll take some from the screen. Well, I'll mix it up a bit, actually. So first question is from Susan Stewart from the SVP in Germany. It's actually related to the disintegration question, I suppose, but Susan doesn't go as far. Do the panelists expect major economic and social instability in Russia, or even secession attempts by some parts of the Russian Federation? Oh, that is a disintegration question. Anyway, she's asking about what about further protests on the streets? I'll take Anna Matvieva's question as well, please, right there, and then Anna Zelkin. Did I see? No, yes, at the back as well. So Anna, two Annas.
Thank you. I'm Anna Matveeva, Russia Institute at King's College London. My question is to Keir about Russia's defeat. Can you please help me out to flesh out some graphic picture, what that would look like? There will be Ukrainian tanks at Red Square with guns aimed at Kremlin. Russia would give up nuclear weapons. There will be some kind of foreign troops, or what that would look like. And related to that, you said that Russia managed to make the West to play by its rules by bombing critical infrastructure. You call for the change of tactics. What this change of tactics would entail, what the West should do instead of what they are doing now is essentially trying to give aid for reconstruction.
Thanks, Anna. And the other Anna is sort of behind you to the left. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Anna Zelkina. Independent. Thank you, Anna Zelkina. I want to start with the disclaimer. In this dispute between James and Keir, I support Keir's point of view. And what you said about Putin being pragmatic in the beginning, I also will say, in my view, supports Keir's argument that it is Russia that pushed him in the direction where he went, because in my view, again, and it's a big kind of philosophical question, how populism and totalitarianism are linked, because you find something raw and then you play on this emotion. I also, another disclaimer, would agree with the view, which is a rather grim view of your Russian diplomat who said that to reform Russian mentality or worldview, that will take the Nazification of the side. I mean, as it happened, which is not possible.
But you have a question,
and
right,
the question is, therefore, would you agree that the only way to deal with Russia, as it is now, is not to putting an emphasis on actually trying to find an elite person or elite in Russia that, again, like in the past, the West can try to manipulate, or rather, for a change, put an emphasis on prioritizing relationship with the neighbors and trying to contain the appetite, whoever comes to power, through what it wants to do and what it can do, by actually putting an emphasis on the countries that are victims of this mentality. And whether the question to Keir is whether you see it is at all possible with the current situation in Western mentality, whether the West is still looking for somebody to influence the society through elites or through limiting their appetites by prioritizing its relationship with neighboring countries and trying to buffer the ability of Russia to.
Okay. It's a bit too long to be fully comprehensible. I think I've got it. Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit guilty. There's a gentleman down here. He's had his hand up for a while. No, we need you, Mike, sorry.
Okay, Bogdan Nahailo, currently chief editor of the Kyiv Post. But 30 years ago on this stage, I think I gave the first presentation at Chatham House on the new Ukraine 30 years ago. Now we're talking about a slightly different Ukraine. First question, two quick questions. First, mainly to Nikolai. Look, you suggest that the war Russia launched against Ukraine began in 1994. Why not 1918? I mean, Russian imperialism, you had a brief period under Kerensky where you had a non-imperialist setup. What happened? And let's remember that the brain exodus now, you had a white emigration. Paris was full of Russians, similar sorts of parallels. And also that Denikin happens to be Putin's big hero, the leader of the white movement, not so much Stalin as people believe. Second question about international affairs. Nobody's touched on that. We need a new security architecture. So perhaps Ukraine ends up in the EU or NATO even. What happens to Russia and its relationship with China, India, and the others? Nobody's talked about that. I'd like to hear perhaps some comments
because
on
we're
that. Thank you.
Not really covering it, but that's fine. I think we'll go back to the panel, if I may. So we've got protests, more on the defeat of Russia from Anna, the emphasis on the victims and the buffer, and new security architecture, if you really want to touch on it. Keir, I think a lot of that was addressed at you, so can I get you to start, and then I'll carry on from there.
First, does there need to be support to the frontline states in order to achieve that aim that I talked about of reducing the amount of harm that Russia can do? Absolutely, yes. It is a core component of containing the damage. It's a core component of dealing with Russia in whatever form it emerges, whether that is a stable, cohesive federal state that is seeking still to project its power outwards, or we have the worst case scenario and it devolves into statelets with private armies warring against each other, and we're trying to contain the spillover effects. In all of those cases, it's absolutely crucial to reinforce that support for the frontline states, because the defense of all of our homelands starts at the border with Russia. Now, the unfortunate net result of that is that in addition to the measures that we were talking about, bolstering our civil society and protecting ourselves at a distance from Russia against subversion, it also implies that you have to invest in defense. And you have to invest in defense capabilities of a kind that are relevant for the sort of war that Russia has demonstrated it can wage. And that is a bit of a problem for countries like the United Kingdom that have structured their armed forces in a way that cannot suffer attrition, because that in itself does not present a deterrent to Russia. So it does require a rethink of how you project power in military terms, as well as reinforcement of all of those ways by which we protect the buffer states, because their future is also our future. On Anna's point about what defeat would look like, yes, we're not talking about overrunning Russia. That's not going to happen. Instead, look at the pattern of all of the kinds of strategic defeats of imperial powers that have led to the kind of change that we're talking about elsewhere. It's just because it's not Russia. It happened a long time ago. It is always when countries try to project power beyond their borders and are rebuffed, they fail. That causes that reassessment of their role in the world, their power, their status, what they're actually entitled to. Whether it's the UK, France, Portugal, go further back in history, Sweden. In each case, it's been a defeat in the occupied territories rather than the homeland being destroyed and occupied that alters that perception. But because this is Russia, and because of that depth of the societal roots of this approach that we're talking about, it will take more than that to force change. And that's where the second part of your question comes in, I think. I'm surprised it took so long for anybody to ask. After I said something needs to be done differently, I was expecting somebody right away to say, well, what exactly would that be? How do we step back from the current situation, which ought to be intolerable for everybody around the world, where Russia can strike at Ukraine with impunity from safe havens, which Ukraine has been denied the capabilities of striking back at? If we think that this is an intolerable situation, then that should be made clear to Russia, because after all, there is no shortage of precedents around the world where this kind of genocidal campaign has been carried out by a larger neighbor and the international community has stepped in. What's the reason why there is no such impetus at the moment? It's the same reason as the excuse we hear so often for not annoying or offending Russia, that Russia is a nuclear power. That campaign that Russia mounted over more than a decade of seeding Western decision-making with this idea that you cannot offend or impede Russia because the inevitable consequences will be military clashes, which inevitably escalate to global conflict, which inevitably lead to nuclear exchanges, has been so effective that it is the bedrock of Western decision-making about how you engage with Russia. It is the root of that very careful, incremental feeling forward for Russia's red lines when trying to support Ukraine, and discovering, of course, at each instance that those red lines evaporate. Because so much of what Russia wants to convince us about how we have to deal with Moscow is based on bluff, on bluster, on rhetoric, on intimidation, rather than based on Russia's actual nuclear doctrine written by the people who own the nuclear weapons. So, to put that in a very short nutshell, if we want this to stop, if the Western community of nations and the world as a whole think that this is an intolerable situation, then present the ultimatum to Russia. It is not only Russia that is capable of escalating.
Thank you very much indeed. It does seem to me that nuclear blackmail is more likely, if you accede to it, is more likely to lead to nuclear war, by the way. So.
That is exactly right. The only logical conclusion for any other country around the world seeing that nuclear weapons gives you a get out of jail free card to do whatever you want is to acquire nuclear weapons as rapidly as you possibly can, because then you get a free pass.
Proliferation, exactly. Claudia, do you want to address Susan Stewart's point on protests? Why haven't we seen any lately?
Well, I think...
Or more to the point, will we see more?
I think that there is much more, the probability of protests in future did increase, and all sociological polls are showing that the situation is changing after the mobilization has been announced. But regime is pretty well prepared, and in spite of facing problems with well, soldiers in Ukraine, they do keep Rosgvardia, police forces to take care of Russian regions in Russia. And I would say that it's not very probable now due to these, well, barbaric laws. You cannot come to the street without facing the opportunity to come to prison for many years. So it means that regime is doing pretty well in order to keep protests under the surface, but it doesn't mean that the situation is that good for the regime. And two more points on empires. I would say that there is temptation to look at Russia as being bad imperial power all time, starting from Peter the Great. It's not that true if to think in terms of international context. Here we're staying in Britain, and British Empire used to be imperial power in Crimean War, for example, for many years. And Ukraine, by the way, was integral part of Russia. And at the time of imperial war in Afghanistan, we should not blame Russia as it exists now, but we should blame the Soviet Union as the country, which, by the way, was led for several decades by ethnic Ukrainians. It's typical for empires. So it's not like, say, not to say that in 1918, Bolsheviks did put pressure on Ukrainian independent forces, but it's not to look at this as easy. And in my view, 1994 was not the beginning of the war with Ukraine. It was the beginning of imperial wars after the new Russia did appear. It took place in Chechnya. It was not connected to Ukraine. Then it was Georgia. Then it was Ukraine. But I would breach with the previous question on whether Russia will change its view of Ukraine. Yes, absolutely. Like Russia did change its view on Finland after being defeated in the war, on Poland after defeat in Poland, on Baltic states. So it's not only probable, it's inevitable, but the problem is how much will be paid for this.
Thank you, Kolya. Anna Maria, do you want to tackle the European security question, new European security architecture question?
So I will try to, but I will also come back a little bit to the question about work with Russian neighbors. Thank you, Kerr. It's why we miss you so much in the EU. Because we have to present that just such a way of thinking together with the boats and probably no one else sometimes. Sorry to be honest. But definitely, yes, Eastern neighborhood was such kind of way of thinking. Of course, it's a huge discussion, is what fruitful or not. Here it comes also a question about Central Asian countries, still a huge challenge for us also when it comes to security issues. But when we are thinking about new security architecture, not only in Europe, I think that, and not only in Euro-Atlantic world, probably the new security architecture as such. Yes, we have to start such kind of the discussion, but still, unless the war in Ukraine is going on, it's very difficult to predict how we can shape and what should be put on such kind of agenda. And yes, we as Poland, as you know very well, we support Ukraine totally in its own path to the EU and to NATO. And from our perspective, yes, NATO is the main guarantees of security in the region. But still is a huge discussion among the alliance how to do so. And probably also something which was somehow missed in the discussion, the proposal of Volodymyr Zelensky, who put this, that if Ukraine won't join NATO, there should be some other security guarantees. And still, I think that we have to think about such kind of guarantees and the whole security architecture and way of thinking. But still, everything will depend what kind of Russia we will have in the end.
Absolutely. Also wondering why Moldova won't join NATO as well. It seems to want all of NATO's benefits, but not actually to join. But maybe that'll come up in the Moldova session later. Right, back to the audience and on screen in line. This gentleman's been waiting for a while, and the lady in blue as well. Right at the front here, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Vitaly. I am from International Broadcaster of Ukraine, and I have one question. I think that there is one legal opposition now in Russia is far-right movement and so-called patriotic people. And they among the most critics of Putin now, and they have right to criticize Putin. And from my point of view, they in some sense de facto authority now because they influence official agenda. What do you think about prospects of these people? And I hear surname Mishustin, Patrushev, and some pragmatic people who could be after Putin. But why this group of so-called patriotic people should share the power if they have weapons, they have ideology? And what do you think about possibility of transformation Russia in real ideological state like Iran, something like that?
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, lady right in the center, well, centerish. Can you just stand up perhaps to might help? Yeah. Thank you.
My name is Maria Zolkina, research fellow at the London School of Economics and head of regional security and conflict studies at Ukrainian think tank Democratic Initiatives Foundation. First of all, just a follow-up question to the previous round of questions regarding the support to Ukraine. First of all, military support, because the strategy or tactics used by Western partners of Ukraine this year to give limited amount and limited types of weapons seems not to be efficient for the next stage of the war when Ukraine has to liberate its territories. And from this point of view, we definitely need tanks, armored vehicles, and long-range missiles. So how do you assess the probability that these all so-called taboos will be abandoned this year, I mean next year, and will enable Ukraine to conduct effective counteroffensive operations on another part of occupied territories? And also a very important question, which is discussed behind the closed doors accurately, but not openly so far. How do you assess the probability that Ukraine will be pushed to think seriously about refusal or de facto refusal from the occupation of Crimea? I don't speak about Donbas because this is something ridiculous for Ukraine to not to try to liberate the whole Donbas.
Okay, thank you. And finally, bottom left corner, literally, it's Ken Stolworthy, please. And I will go back to the screen after that. I'm aware we've got many waiting on the screen.
You've all
Just
sort of
introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, Ken Stolworthy, the Department of Defense, Russia Strategic Initiative, work with Chatham House. You're all sort of poo-pooing the fact that destabilization or a dramatic change could happen over time. I think that's probably the standard thing. But as we're witnessing Chinese protests, Iranian protests, is there potential for a black swan that we're all missing because we're all such experts here? So we've got anecdotal evidence that the non-Russian nationals are suffering more casualties. We have the Rosgvard getting hit on the chin and coming back. We have the latest thing with 30% increase in use of weaponry in crimes. And I think obviously a lot of proliferation of that's going to happen. So are we possibly missing the forest through the trees that will have a population that is ready and ripe for protest, is potentially armed, and the authorities that are either ill-equipped because they've been decimated, or they have a change of mind about cracking heads, something that others talk about, and maybe an FSB that got it really wrong in Ukraine, not actually being able to understand its own backyard. So I just like us to think about
thanks,
that.
Ken. And I've realized actually we're really coming up on time, so I'm going to take now, if you don't mind holding them. I've got them written down here so no one can escape. But Walter Kaufmann from the Heinrich Böll Foundation says, probably for you, anybody, Joanna, could be anybody. How do you think the Russian diaspora will develop? And how deeply rooted is Russian colonial thinking, even amongst democratic opponents of a regime? Very interesting point. And I'll take one finally from Joe Alsop from the FCDO. Does Iran or post-Iran, does Iran of a post-Iran Iraq war offer a potential model of the societal isolation that Russia may experience? So we're gonna have to go through, I'll give you, you can pick and choose, or I'll try and remind you if you don't quite get there, and maybe I'll just go this way along. So Anna Maria first, ending in Kolya.
Okay, so probably I will just focus on military support to Ukraine. I totally agree with you that it should be much more. We're trying to do the best from our side. Probably also it will be quick advertisement next week. PISM will publish a huge report. What should be done not only in collecting post-Soviet armor and equipment, but also the new NATO systems to Ukraine, and why is so important. So I totally agree with you that definitely it's the first step to liberate Ukraine, and then to discuss how to reestablish this state. About patriotic opposition, you know, it's a very so-called, it's a very tough question, because if they are nationalistic opposition, then it may come that we have Imperium 2.0, even more aggressive towards their own neighbors. And when it comes to Iran, I think no, because of plenty reasons.
Yeah. Do you want to pick and choose, or shall I pick one for you?
Can I take the Black Swan one?
You absolutely can.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of the possibility of unrest, are we downplaying it? People were becoming more and more dissatisfied. I think the risks of going out to protest are so high now. You know, it needs to be what could potentially generate unrest in the current circumstances. You know, I think watch for further waves of mobilization. That would, for me, would be something, because if it's young men who, you know, see a high likelihood of losing their lives in Ukraine, or, you know, getting locked up at home for protesting, you know, that's, you know, perhaps that's a sort of scenario where protesting makes sense. Also watch for March 2024, which, you know, we got used to elections not meaning much in Russia, but even in repressive authoritarian regimes, if you have at least a fake phony election, that can sometimes be a sort of rallying call for people who feel dissatisfied to come out. So perhaps, I mean, it's all speculation, really, isn't it?
It's informed speculation by highly experienced experts. Yeah, I feel you should take Black Swan. I feel you might want to take. You've done support for Ukraine as well.
That's all right. I mean, it doesn't count as opposition in the terms that we're describing if it's not upset at what Russia is doing. It's upset that Russia isn't doing it better, faster, and harder. So in that respect, no, it's a change for the worse if that does happen. Maria. Yes, absolutely. But of course, the taboos are not the only reason for constraint on what is being supplied to Ukraine. There are plenty of other reasons, some of which make sense, some of which don't. We think back to the beginning of the conflict, where there was a reasonable objection that you couldn't supply Ukraine with combat aircraft because it would take 6 months for them to be an effective capability 9 months ago. Never mind that, there are other constraints on why this can't happen, but will the taboo persist? I think absolutely yes. If in the face of all evidence to the contrary, it is still such a drag on what is on the assistance that's provided to Ukraine, I think that has every prospect of continuing. And Black Swans, always there's the possibility. We see the ingredients for destabilization and collapse building. We don't see them building to the extent that it has become an imminent prospect, as so many people have hoped for. Having said that, it's always a slow process that suddenly becomes incredibly rapid, and then it's all blindingly obvious after it happened. But that's only after the fact, and nobody ever gets the right moment to call it.
I would just say before I come to you, Kolya, but my view is that in my experience, you need to be an exceptionally liberal Russian to not have that deeply rooted colonial thinking. You've got to be a Vladimir Karamuzar, you've got to be a Lilia Shevtsova, you've got to be a Nikolai Petrov, quite frankly, and they are rare as hen's teeth. So I think it's a very good point from Volta. Kolya, on the perhaps you can take whatever you want, but maybe the diaspora question for you as well. What do you see its future as?
Thank you so much. I would say that, in my view, this question is very serious and very complicated. And in my view, it's connected with the fact that so far we do see a very reactive position of Western countries instead of being proactive, instead of being strategic with regard to Russia and what it's doing in Ukraine and with regard to diaspora as well. And all those sanctions which were aimed to put more pressure onto Putin and the regime and to stop the war somehow are negatively working in case of those Russians who do not agree with the regime and who are out of the country. So there are two kinds of diasporas, one which did exist earlier, and here I think support of Putin's regime can be visible. And there is another new diaspora consisting of those who are coming. And in my view, it's needed to be much more strategic and much more proactive in a way it's treated in Germany and in many other countries. Speaking about far rights, I would say that in my view, the Kremlin is pretty much afraid of them. And you should have in mind that there was huge pressure put on nationalists. They were killed, they were put into prisons and so on. But partly the fact that you see their criticism of Putin is intentional. And it's easy for Putin to demonstrate that, look at what others are saying to push me in a certain direction. And I am pretty much moderate in comparison to them. There is real threat of those guys like Prigozhin or Kadyrov having weapons and having their almost criminal gangs which are fighting now in Ukraine and which can bring all these weapons to Russia. So we should think in terms of very serious risks in Europe in whole, not only in Russia and in Ukraine, connected with the fact that there are, huge weapons are now and will necessarily come to the criminal world. And there are already some signs that it's going on. However, I do disagree strongly with the idea that it's not Putin, it's Russia which did push Putin in this direction. I would say that, in my view, Putin did evolve very seriously since he came to power. But what he is doing now and what he did already is the result of the evolution of his regime, but not of habits and feelings of Russia and Russians. So it's pretty natural evolution of the regime. And genocide we were speaking about is a kind of side effect. It's not aimed to kill Russians. It's not aimed to kill ethnic minorities, but it comes as a result of those steps the Kremlin is doing without having in mind that the human life, being it Russian or Buryat or Ukrainian, does have certain value. And I do not see any real, consequences coming immediately in ethnic regions, because to a large extent, the problem with Buryats, for example, or Tuvinians, the ratio of them is higher, is first connected with more publicity. In ethnic republics, it's more public. In Russian ethnic regions, it's not told that this or that soldier or officer was killed. And partly it's due to depressive character of these regions. And for them, to serve in the army and to get salary which is 10 times higher than the average one is is the single opportunity to have a kind of social lift.
Kolya, thank you very much indeed. We've come to the end of a very rich session, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd always rather have questions that can't be answered, although they've done their very, very best, than answers that can't be questioned, which is what has happened here today. My team know that I'm quite fond of quoting the American writer, the persecuted American writer, James Baldwin. He said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think that's really relevant for the rest of today. We will have equally rich sessions on Ukraine, the economy, breakouts, and a final wrap-up session. But for now, we've got half an hour of coffee, I believe. But in the meantime, would you thank this outstanding panel?